Walrus reads w, w, w. W reads w, w, w.
Wacky the walrus went walking one day. Along came the west wind and blew him away.
Wacky Walrus. Wacky Walrus was very pleased because he was so big. My, but he was huge. He had a great wrinkled body, rolling with fat, and a tough, rough hide. He had whiskers that bristled, and he had two enormous tusks hanging down from each side of his mouth. What a fierce-looking creature Wacky Walrus was. Now, maybe you wonder why he was called Wacky Walrus. That's such a funny name for a walrus. Well, it seems that when Wacky Walrus was born, his parents were so proud of him, they wanted to give him a very dignified, important-sounding name. They decided that Wackelhauser Walrus was a fine-sounding name. Wow! Wackelhauser Walrus. That was all right when he was small. However, when he became a young walrus, the name Wackelhauser Walrus was just a wee bit cumbersome. His walrus playmates soon shortened his name to Wacky Walrus. They were not making fun of Wacky Walrus, they just needed a shorter name to call him. Now, Wacky Walrus was big enough for a big name like Wackelhauser Walrus. But everyone was used to calling him Wacky Walrus. It seemed awfully unfriendly to yell, "Hey, Wackelhauser Walrus, come and play with us." So he was still Wacky Walrus to his friends. Wacky Walrus liked some things about being big. No one could push him around. He was just too big. Sometimes, though, he got tired of dragging around his big body. "I wish I were little like you," he said to a grasshopper one day. "Why would you want to be little like me, Wacky Walrus? I think it would be fine to be huge like you. You have no idea how hard life is when you are as small as I am," replied the grasshopper. "You have no idea how hard life is when you are as big as I am. I tell you, it would be wonderful to be small." "Let's change places," said the grasshopper, not really meaning it. "All right," said Wacky Walrus, not really meaning it either. Can you guess what happened? Wacky Walrus did not know how, but he had become very tiny. Suddenly, wee Wacky Walrus looked up in surprise. What was that enormous foot lying near his head? It was long and thin and green. What kind of creature was this? He looked up. There were gigantic green legs like a grasshopper's, an enormous head with two bulging eyes that looked like a grasshopper. Wacky Walrus knew that never in this world had there been such a huge grasshopper. Wacky Walrus decided to move a little farther away before that enormous foot slipped and stepped on him. But there was something in his way. A huge boulder almost the size of a tree. From where had that come? It was not there before. Wee Wacky Walrus had been standing on smooth gravel. Now, All around Wacky Walrus, as far as he could see, were large rocks that he could not even climb over. What had happened? Suddenly, it began to get dark. Something was blocking the light from the sun. It looked like a huge maple leaf, big and flat. Wee Wacky Walrus scrambled furiously to get out of the way. Splat! The big leaf almost missed him, but one corner hit Wacky Walrus with a thump on the head. Oh, but he was dizzy. He sat perfectly still for a moment, trying to figure out what had happened. What had caused everything to change? How had everything on the earth suddenly gotten too large for him? How had Wacky Walrus changed? He couldn't figure it all out. The breeze, which had blown the maple leaf onto wee Wacky Walrus, began to swirl around again. It was a playful west wind, the kind that used to tickle his large walrus nose. Now, the west wind didn't seem playful. It didn't just tickle his nose. That west wind knocked wee Wacky Walrus right off his feet. Plop! He went down on his stomach. Before Wacky Walrus could even think about standing up, there was a whoosh, and the west wind lifted Wacky Walrus right off the ground. The west wind was carrying Wacky Walrus right through the air. He was so stunned he couldn't believe it. How could the wind pick up a walrus? It was incredible and unbelievable. He knew now what had happened. He had somehow become a wee walrus, and everything else had stayed the same size. Poor Wacky Walrus was being carried around by the west wind. "I thought it was hard to be big," said wee Wacky Walrus. "That was because I never tried being tiny. Now that I have tried it, I don't think I like it very much. I want to be my right size again." Wee Wacky Walrus wasn't sure just what happened, but he went plop into a field of tall grass. It wasn't exactly an easy landing because Wacky Walrus was so big again. At least he didn't land on a rock. As Wacky Walrus shook his big head and rubbed his eyes, he saw his small grasshopper friend hopping toward him. Everything was right again. Wacky Walrus was big and the grasshopper was a wee size. "Being big is right for me, and being small is right for you. I'm sorry I ever complained," Wacky Walrus said to his grasshopper friend. "You just can't understand someone else's problems until you have had them." Wacky Walrus looked around him contentedly. "Really, I'm just glad to be me. The size I am, the way I am, it's a mighty good thing just to be satisfied." Bible story. Do you ever wish you were bigger? Some things are hard for little people. They cannot see a parade if someone tall stands in front of them. They cannot reach the top shelves of the cabinet. Their legs sometimes do not reach the floor when they sit in a chair. Yes, little people sometimes have a hard time. The Bible tells us a story about a man who was very short. His name was Zacchaeus. Say it with me, Zacchaeus. When Jesus came to the town of Jericho, all the people wanted to see him. They came out of their houses and lined up along the street to see and hear Jesus. This little man, Zacchaeus, wanted to see Jesus, but he could not. Zacchaeus stood there, stretching his neck this way and that way, trying to see around the person in front of him. Every time he moved, the person in front of him moved. Jesus was about to pass, and Zacchaeus still could not see over the crowd. How he wanted to see Jesus! Maybe he pushed a little bit, trying to squeeze his way through the crowd. Maybe he looked for a friend who would let him stand closer. Nothing worked. Jesus was going to pass, and Zacchaeus was not even going to get to see or hear him. Finally, Zacchaeus had an idea. A big sycamore tree was just ahead near the roadway. I'll run on ahead of the crowd and climb that big sycamore tree. Then I can see Jesus. Quickly, Zacchaeus ran ahead. There were not so many people there. If he could just climb the tree quickly, he would get to see Jesus. The crowd was coming closer, he could tell. Zacchaeus may have been worried about his sins and wondered if Jesus could really forgive him. Zacchaeus was an important man. Perhaps he did not want people to know that he had sinned or that he has worried about it. But Zacchaeus knew in his heart he had sinned. Maybe seeing Jesus would help. We don't know whether or not Zacchaeus intended to speak to Jesus. Perhaps Zacchaeus had hoped no one would know he was there. But as Jesus walked along and Zacchaeus eagerly watched him, something happened that Zacchaeus did not expect. Jesus looked up and saw him. Zacchaeus looked into Jesus' eyes and saw Jesus' love. Then, just think of it. Jesus spoke to Zacchaeus. Jesus called Zacchaeus by his name. Zacchaeus, hurry and come down. Today, I want to go to stay at your house. How happy and excited Zacchaeus was. I am sure Zacchaeus did hurry just as fast as he could. Zacchaeus knew Jesus was God and that Jesus could forgive sin. Zacchaeus said, Lord, I'm going to give half of my money to feed the poor. And if I have taken anything from anyone wrongly, I am going to pay back 4 times what I took. Jesus said, Today, salvation is come to your house, Zacchaeus. And then Jesus gave us one of the most wonderful verses in the Bible. Jesus said, The Son of Man is come to seek and to save that which was lost.